Well, we're on the home stretch of this election season. We've only got a few more days to go before it's all over. And I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about why I am not going to be voting for Trump again. I voted for him in 2016. I bought a bunch of his hats. I bought more of his hats this year, this election cycle. But I stopped about 3 weeks or a month ago when he came out with this platinum plan. The 500 billion Cuckbucks that he wants to do for black economic empowerment. And I use the scare quotes because, it's not just an innocent phrase that has a literal meaning. Like Black Lives Matter, it is a slogan, and it's already being used for something else. Black Lives Matter is a Marxist political movement, which has not only a main false narrative driving it, but a whole bunch of other Marxist political agendas on top of that. And black economic empowerment is an anti-white affirmative action program run by the ANC in the Rainbow Nation of South Africa. And of course, the ANC is also a Marxist political party, which is it's a coalition of parties that includes the South African Communist Party. And like all affirmative action programs, it's prejudice against the supposedly overrepresented demographic, which would be whites, and it sets arbitrary targets for firms in terms of how many blacks they have to hire, how many have to be managers, how many have to be owners, irrespective of their qualifications for those positions, irrespective of their actual merits for those positions. And it just sets arbitrary targets. Now, even if you're an environmentalist and you believe that all of the differences between groups are ultimately down to environmental factors, you still can't deny that there are differences between groups. And so even if you set that argument aside, just mandating proportional or proportionally equal representation across a wide variety of categories is a foolish and destructive policy. But, black economic empowerment itself is not necessarily senseless. If you're just looking at the literal meaning of that phrase, if you're setting aside the fact that it's a label or a slogan for, a prejudiced anti-white program that's already in existence somewhere, it's not necessarily a senseless idea. And I could see how if they are likely to blame us for all of their problems, if they have less problems, it makes sense that, we would have less problems. At least that's a reasonable supposition. It may not necessarily hold. But to choose that name in particular and some of the other things about the way that this plan is structured as proposed make it, a really terrible plan. And one of the things that does that is it proposes going after Antifa and the KKK. Now, I don't know why those two groups are lumped together. And I don't think it's a good idea to set the precedent that to go after somebody on the left, you also have to go after somebody on the right or who's seen to be on the right. I don't know why you would want to set that precedent. I don't know why you would want to give your enemies that much consideration. But apparently that's what Trump wants to do. And it also reinforces the false narrative that there's a problem in America with the KKK. Folks, the only problem in America with the KKK is that it's a fed honeypot, which basically exists at this point to entrap anybody who's dumb enough to get involved with it unironically. That's the only problem here. And to reinforce this false narrative that, the KKK is a thing that is, active, that's doing anything, and is causing any kind of problems other than that it's a false narrative, and it's a, defamatory anti-white narrative as well. And furthermore, going after them implicitly legitimizes everything that the KKK has historically opposed. And it arose, three different times in American history in response to three different, time periods, episodes of progressive provocation, if you will, against heritage America, against white America. The first was Reconstruction after the Civil War, and it arose as a response to that, or as a resistance to that. The second was in the 1920s, in response to a massive wave of immigration, mostly of Catholics and Jews from Eastern Europe, which was fairly disruptive and provoked a broad-based nativist backlash, not just the rise of the KKK, but a broad-based nativist pushback that ultimately succeeded in imposing America's most stringent immigration restrictions and its, the ethnic status quo system that existed from the 1920s to the 1960s. So it was part of a much larger nativist movement and sentiment at that time that was provoked by that particular wave of mass immigration. Thirdly, to the civil rights era, which, again, the civil rights, I'm going to say that the civil rights movement started off innocently enough with like the Booker T. Washingtons and like kind of a classical liberal strain to it. I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of that or all of classical liberalism. I think it goes wrong in a number of ways, but certainly it was relatively innocuous compared to what came later. After Booker T. Washington passed away and was no longer on the scene, and the leadership of the civil rights movement passed on to more radical, more socialist types like W.E.B. Du Bois. See, Booker T. Washington was more in this black economic empowerment vein, where he was encouraging blacks to build businesses, to build schools, to acquire skills, and to build up, from the bottom up, starting with the fundamentals, satisfying the preconditions for more economic and social equality, before demanding political equality and political representation, which ultimately amounts to political power over, let's say, white America. But Du Bois didn't have that patience. He went right for demanding equality, demanding political representation, demanding political power. And, that's how the civil rights movement has carried on ever since. And, with forced integration, literally at bayonet point in many cases, disregard for and violation of freedom of association and property rights for white Americans. And, carrying right on up to like the Section 8 of today, where even, the suburbs are being forcefully integrated at our own expense. The people who fled to the suburbs to escape integration in the urban areas, were followed by people using their own money, those suburbanites' money, to come and live next to them. Now, so the problem with demonizing the KKK and pretending that it's still an issue and all this is that it implicitly legitimates all those things that it historically arose as a reaction against. So that's just one of the many reasons it's a bad idea. And something else that was in this platinum ban was something about lynching and creating a new hate crime law or something. And this is another defamatory, false narrative. We never hear the end of this lynching business. And people, the way people talk about it, you'd think that millions of people were lynched historically. When in actual fact, if you look up the statistics, there are about 4,000 recorded instances over a century. 4,000 instances over a century, which is only about 40 a year. And, only about 3,000 of those were blacks. So it's not necessarily specifically racially motivated. And in many cases, these were a reaction to legitimate provocations, to real crimes, to real transgressions, sometimes of a very serious nature. So people tend to exaggerate, at least implicitly, the scale of the phenomena. They tend to exaggerate the innocence of those affected by the phenomenon. And you never hear about the 500 whites who are murdered by blacks every year today. So every 8 years, as many whites die being murdered by blacks as, well, every 6 years, as blacks were lynched over a century. So you never hear about this much larger scale violence that's going on today against whites perpetrated by blacks. So it's a cherry picking of history and an exaggeration of a thing that happened in history that constitutes a false and defamatory narrative against white people and against America and against Western civilization. So, I don't know what good it does to put that false narrative in this platinum plan. There's a simple solution to this anyway. If it was a problem, I don't even know why this is still considered an issue. Are they going to use this lynching provision to go after BLM and Antifa mobs that are mobbing up and attacking people? Because that's the only lynching I can think of that's going on today. If there's any kind of problem with lynching, that's the only example I can think of today. So is this like a bait and switch where they're going to use it to go after them? If so, it's pretty funny, but it also does reinforce a false and defamatory narrative. So I think it's ultimately counterproductive. And there's a simple solution to lynching if it were an actual problem, which it isn't. There would be a simple solution, and that would just be to do justice. Because people take justice into their own hands when they don't feel like justice is being done. So if you want people not to take justice into their own hands, just do justice. When the government does justice, when it administers justice faithfully and completely, then you don't have this problem with lynching. Oh, one other instance where you could say that this is a thing is with respect to pedophiles, because pedophiles do experience a high amount of, let's say, vigilante violence, both within and without prison. Within prison and outside of it. They experience a high rate of vigilante violence. And that's because the penalties that they are handed by the quote-unquote justice system are laughably light compared to the offenses that they commit. So justice is not being done. The way these people are handled by the justice system is a miscarriage of justice. And that's why people attempt to take justice into their own hands. So if you don't want that to happen, do justice. Just do justice. That's what government can do to prevent this from being a problem. So I don't know why we need a hate crimes order or bill, or I don't know what it exactly is that's being proposed, but some kind of hate crime provision having to do with lynching. So those are some reasons I'm against this platinum plan for black economic empowerment. And the other reason is just because it feels kind of like reparations, right? It feels kind of reparation-y. And I know that's not what it's billed as explicitly, but that kind of feels like the spirit in which it's offered, right? But I don't think it's right to do that, to offer that, to extend that offer, that benefit, those considerations, those concessions, any kind of reparations in response to lawless mob violence like we've been seeing for the last 6 or 8 months. Because when you burn down cities, you don't get reparations, you owe reparations. Okay, so you're not entitled to reparations for those kind of violent outbursts, those kind of destructive, violent mob episodes. And it just doesn't sit right to me that something even remotely like reparations is being offered apparently in response to that kind of behavior. Because the fundamental issue with reparations at any time, and especially in this time, is it doesn't end anything. They can't credibly guarantee that that will be the end of it, that they will consider bygones to be bygones and the debt to be settled and the score to be equalized or whatever. They can't credibly offer that because we know the reparations are going to be squandered. We know the inequality is going to persist because it's more fundamental than that. It's not something you can throw money at. Mark Twain pointed this out over 100 years ago with respect to communism. He said if you redistributed all the wealth, it wouldn't be any time at all before it'd go back to being unequally distributed again, because it takes similar qualities to keep wealth as it does to create wealth or to earn wealth or to amass wealth. And if you just redistribute it, it doesn't settle or solve the underlying inequality, which is fundamental, which is real. Like, it's not an artifact. It's not imaginary. Now, there is, maybe one sense in which I would concede something to the egalitarian side of the argument, which is that, I don't consider equality to be a good thing as such. I consider inequality to be the good thing. All right, but you can have too much of a good thing. There is a point beyond which more inequality doesn't incentivize people to work harder or do better or follow the example set by their betters. And beyond a certain point, it no longer does that, and it causes envy and resentment and bitterness, and causes violence and unrest and crime. And if hierarchies are too steep, then people's hope of climbing those hierarchies by peaceful and orderly means within the rules of the system are low, and they resort to desperate measures to try to improve their lot in life, to try to, claw their way up the hierarchy. And that isn't necessarily good for anyone, and it isn't even necessarily good for the people at the top of a steep hierarchy, because, they're going to be beset by all sorts of threats and plots and challenges to their position in that hierarchy that they wouldn't necessarily experience in a shallower hierarchy. Yes, there's always going to be competition to take the top places in a hierarchy. That's a given. To an extent, we want that. But a relatively shallower hierarchy, that competition may be limited to like fair play and meritocratic competition. And even if you're, let's say, more likely to lose your position. I don't even know if you'd be more likely to lose your position if that kind of competition is allowed at a low level, at a rule-abiding level. I don't even know if you'd be more likely to lose your position at the top of your hierarchy, but you would certainly face less dire threats to your position in the hierarchy. Anyway, that's a digression. It doesn't matter. Equality is not a positive good to be sought after, but I will concede that inequality, even though it is a positive good, beyond a certain point, it ceases to be good and starts to become harmful. But the issue with the reparations is that if a certain kind of behavior like the rioting and the looting, or even just the whining and the accusations and the demands that preceded it, if that kind of behavior gets you reparations in one instance, and then you squander them, as we know inevitably they will, and then they're right back in the position they were in, more or less. Maybe some of them will make something good of it, but most of them probably wouldn't. Otherwise, they'd have made something good with everything they've already been given. But if that behavior suffices to get you reparations in one instance, then people are just going to repeat it again. It's like rewarding a child for having a temper tantrum. You're only going to get more temper tantrums. You're not going to, if you placate that child at all, it's only going to be temporarily. The long-term situation is going to be made much, much worse. And so that's why I would insist on no reparations without separation. That's the only way to guarantee that that's the end of it. Like, you can have your 40 acres and a mule or whatever, but it can't be here. It can't be in our country. That'd be one way of handling it. That would guarantee that that's the end of it. That's the finito. It's over. So without some way of making that guarantee, and separation would be a way of making that guarantee, then it's just not worthwhile to do, no matter what the historical facts were, no matter how true the narratives were, which we know they're not, but even if they were, it wouldn't be worth making reparations unless that was the end of it, unless there was a credible way to guarantee that. And separation is a way to guarantee that. So no reparations without separation. Now, there's a couple of other things I'm a little frustrated about. Too, there's the Amy Coney Barrett thing. Like, I'm glad he appointed a new conservative justice to the Supreme Court. Excuse me. I'm glad he did it quickly. But I'm not thrilled about it being a woman. Like, I know Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a woman. And I know the idea was the fewer things you change, the less resistance there'll be. But I mean, there was all sorts of other things. You could have appointed a leftist Jewish woman, and then there would have been even less resistance. So what's the point of that? I mean, it's a trade-off. I understand there's less resistance, but there's also less benefit. And specifically with women in the judiciary, I think that's like, besides the military, that's maybe the place where they least belong. In 2016, I was voting in Alaska. There were a bunch of judicial candidates on the ballot, like several pages of them, dozens and dozens of candidates. And it was all nonpartisan races, and all you could vote for each candidate listed. Some were incumbents, some were challenging, I guess, for those offices. All you could do was vote yes or no for each one. And rather than researching dozens and dozens of candidates, I just voted no for every woman and everyone with a foreign-sounding name, and yes for everyone else. And I probably voted for a few shit-lib guys, but for zero work, it'd be hard to come up with a better heuristic than that. That takes zero work. I think I did pretty well, probably better than most people did, and with a lot less work. And this year, I'll be voting in North Carolina. I am going to vote in state and local races. And, there's one judicial race here in North Carolina where the Republicans are running a woman against a male Democrat incumbent. And I looked up the male Democrat. I don't even know if he's an incumbent. It might be the other way around. But there's a Republican woman running against a Democrat man, and he's a total shit lib. I looked him up. But I'm going to vote for him just to punish the Republicans for running a woman against him. There's no reason for that in the judiciary. And part of the reason is, so the big reason Amy Coney Barrett is being nominated is because of her position on abortion. And I'm broadly in favor of overturning Roe versus Wade and kicking this issue back to the states and making it, harder to get an abortion in most cases. But the problem I have with women and this issue is on both sides of the issue, women are the most zealous. It seems like most of them are 100% for or 100% against. They're either all the way, a life is a life, abortion is murder, or they're all the way, my body, my choice. If you don't have a uterus, you don't even get to have an opinion. So they don't have any nuance on this issue. They're moralistic. They reduce it to a black and white, moral dichotomy and they go 100% one way or 100% the other, which is, if you're going to go 100% one way, going 100% pro-life is better than going 100% pro-choice. I'm maybe like 95% pro-life. I still think abortion is not only permissible, but actually morally good in certain instances, like to save the life of the mother, or in the case of rape, or in the case of like serious defect or deformity, then I think it's actually good and should be encouraged. I would say mandated, because I'm not so much pro-life as anti-choice, but I know that mandated, even in those very select instances, that's not a hill I want to die on, because whatever I think about the issue, it's not the issue that defines my views or defines me. Certainly not in the way that most women would take up this view with a fervor in one way or the other, but they're going to be 100% one way or 100% the other. So I just don't think they have very nuanced views or any kind of understanding of limits or trade-offs. Well, this is a good principle within these limits. But there are trade-offs against other issues, against other goods, against other values. And outside of those limits, those trade-offs might go the other way. Okay? So I don't think reducing it to a black and white moralism and going all one way or all the other is necessarily the best approach. But I do think it's the approach that women tend to take. And that's part of why I don't think they have a role in the judiciary. So, whatever. I wouldn't have ceased my support for Trump over the Amy Coney Barrett thing without the Platinum Plan. The Platinum Plan is probably, it's the main reason and the biggest reason why I'm no longer supporting Trump, why I'm no longer on the Trump train. I still hope he wins, and I'll still be glad if he wins, because he is better than the alternative. But for me, it's not enough to be better. You also have to be better enough. And Trump has always been a very mixed bag. Like, he does some good things, he says some good things, but he also cucks for Israel, and he's one side of the kosher sandwich, and he's always going on about black unemployment and Hispanic unemployment and all this kind of stuff, pandering to demographics that will not vote for him, and taking for granted demographics that he shouldn't take for granted, that he should. I would like him to pander to me. If he pandered to me, if he pandered to me more, I would vote for him. And he does some of that very implicitly, but he won't do it explicitly, whereas he will go after these other votes, the black vote and the Hispanic vote and the women vote and the kosher vote, or maybe he's just going after the cuck vote, that want to be reassured that, they're not voting for a racist, or these things are important to them for some reason, or, I don't know. But, he is better than the alternative. I'll grant him that. He is probably the best presidential candidate and even the best president of my lifetime. I'll give him that. But he's not better enough at this point. And I was willing to let all that other stuff slide and vote for him. And I was even enthusiastic to vote for him right up until the Cuckbucks, right up until the Platinum Plan, the Black Economic Empowerment. Because he has done some good stuff. He's dramatically reduced immigration. Even before the Rona, he had reduced it by almost 40%. So that's great. It's the most important thing. He's the only president of my lifetime who has done that for us. Every other one has increased it. So that's big. And then, of course, since the Rona, it's gone down 92% over the same time last year. So that's huge. And I don't know if that reduction will hold, but even the 40%, I'll take it. And not being overtly hostile and overtly anti-white, much better than the other side, for sure. And like recently when the Navy SEALs, the Navy changed their creed to be gender neutral. Trump said they were going to have to change it back. I love it. So he has done some good stuff. He's kept us out of more pointless wars, which is another big one. Besides immigration, that's maybe the biggest thing that he's done. So he has delivered some stuff. I don't want anybody to think I'm being totally ungrateful or I'm purity spiraling here, because I know politics is always a compromise. You're never going to get everything that you want. But, for me, Trump is he's no longer delivering enough, and he's promising too much to too many other people for me to want to support him any longer. So if you still want to vote for him, that's fine. I'm not going to get on your case about that. It's valid to vote for him. It's valid not to vote for him. The only thing that's not valid is to vote for the other guy, right? There's no excuse for that. There's no explanation for that other than mental or moral defect, on par with Joe Biden, which would be considerable. That's what it would take for somebody to actually vote for him. And I understand there's some people who are planning on doing that out of accelerationist motives. I don't think that's a great idea. First of all, because I don't think that's a valid motive. But second of all, even if it was, I think electing Trump is obviously going to be more accelerationist. At least it's going to provoke more drama more quickly and more assuredly than electing Biden. Because if Biden gets elected, conservatives aren't going to do shit. They might if he starts telling people to confiscate guns. But conservatives aren't going to do shit just for him getting elected. There's some stupid things he could do to provoke some drama, but it's not going to necessarily follow from him getting elected. And even if he does get elected, the leftists might engage in some jubilant drama. They might engage in some celebratory violence and unrest and lawlessness. But we know if Trump gets elected, they're definitely going to go out on the streets and cause some drama, cause some trouble, cause some violence. So if you're an accelerationist, that's your best bet, honestly. But I've already emotionally divested from the outcome of this election. I would prefer that Trump win, but not enough to actually go out and help him win personally, myself. I will vote in state and local elections. I encourage you to do the same. I don't care what you do in federal elections as long as you're not voting for the Democrats. And, what I'd like to see, there's a very slim possibility that what Trump represents can be built upon and continued for much longer. Probably it'll end with him. Once he leaves, the Democrats will take back over, and they're going to have the demographics behind them to stay in power. But there's a slim possibility that could be averted. And one way to avert it would be to keep pushing the Democrats towards the loony left. Keep them doubling down and tripling down on the lunacy that is alienating broad swaths of the middle from them. And keep pushing them into radicalism and ultimately irrelevance. I think maybe that's the only way possible to sustain that. And then I'd like to see a real right-wing party emerge, ultimately to challenge the Republican Party, because I think that would be a better duopoly, a right-wing party versus the Republican Party. That would be a better duopoly than the one we have now. But even before that's possible, a right-wing party, even if it's only getting single-digit results in the elections, even if it's only drawing single-digit support, could force the Republican Party to be more strident and more conservative and more right-wing if it knows it can lose votes in either direction. Because if it doesn't have that pressure from the right, then the incentive of the Republican Party is to go as left as possible without passing the Democrats to try to scoop up as many votes as possible from the Democrats. If they can narrow the gap between them and the Democrats, presumably if there's anybody in that gap between them, they'll go for whichever party is closer. So if they can narrow that gap, they can scoop up more of those votes, and they can count on the people to the right of them supporting them. Well, I don't think they should be able to count on that. There should be a party to the right of them, even if it only draws single-digit support at first, so that they know that they can lose votes to the right as well. And that'll keep them more towards the center, at least, instead of having to go left all the time to scoop up votes to try and win elections. That'll at least keep them as principled centrists, and then we can build a right-wing party, hopefully over time, to challenge them. This is a long shot. This is a pipe dream. I understand, but that's what I would like to see. Now, more likely, what's going to happen is the Democrats are going to get back in power at some point. And they're going to have the demographics behind them to keep that for a very long time. Decades at least. And then we're going to have to think about other solutions. Things like, our Second Amendment sanctuaries, and federalism, and secessionism, and jury nullification. And all of these things have to be, strategies have to be underlain fundamentally by a commitment to culture war and a commitment to demographic war. Because, politics is downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from demographics. But even in the medium and long term, even if the Democrats get back in as the ruling party, and I think that that's why they're so freaked out right now about being out of the halls of power, about being away from the most potent levers of power at the moment. That's always been a temporary setback for them, because they still have the deep state, they still have the institutions, they still have the corporations, and they still have all of that. But I think they sensed that something was different this time, and that's why they freaked out so hard. They sensed that they're not just temporarily on the outs. They sensed that they might have actually lost the baton. They might have actually become the opposition party, and not simply the ruling party temporarily out of office, which is what they've always been since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Even when the Republicans got in office, it was just because the Democrats pushed a little too far, a little too fast. They just overplayed their hand a little bit. All they had to do was tone it down, and they would take the office back in the next election or the one after that. And that's all they really had to do this time, too. But I think maybe there was at least a possibility that the baton was passed at the last election. And that's why they freaked out so hard. Because there's a slim possibility, if there's a worthy successor to Trump, which I also don't see really waiting in the wings. I don't really see that. So, again, it's a slim possibility because that doesn't appear to be there. But most likely the Democrats will get back in office. And we've got a generation or two of culture war and demographic struggle to get back to the point where we can challenge them, or, radical things like secession, to get back to the point where we can reclaim our sovereignty. And that's what we need to be focusing on for the long term and the medium term. And that's what I'm going to be making more content about, and less about, stuff like this election. And we need to put the pressure on. We need to let these people know that it's not enough just to be better. You also have to be better enough. And that's why we need a real right-wing party to keep the pressure on and let them know that they can lose votes to the right.